Good evening. My name is Shramana Biswas. I welcome you to the Stories of Tribal Identity and Culture that will explore the role of tribal literature and tribal representation in literature in shaping cultural identity and ideology, curated under TMYS Review December 2023 in collaboration with the Center for Asia Pacific Initiatives, University of Victoria. We are also calling for the submission of essays, poems, and short stories under the project. To know more about the submission guidelines and the project architecture, please visit www.tellmeyourstory.biz. This evening, I consider myself very privileged to be in the company of our esteemed panelists, Dr. Ivy Imogen Hansdag and Dr. Onnoy Mukhopadhyay, who will shortly share their views and insights with us. The topic of today's discussion is tribal representation in theology and myth, characters in religious and quasi-religious texts. Before we begin, I would like to introduce our speakers. Dr. Ivy Imogen Hansdag is a poet, scholar, and translator, employed as Associate Professor in the Department of English, Jamia Millia Islamia, New Delhi. She did her MPhil on The Tribal as the Primitive Other in Indian Literature, a study of three texts from the Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, and her PhD on conversion, marginalization, and emancipation in three women's narratives, also from JNU. She has authored two poetry collections titled The Golden Cord and The Prism of Life, uh, besides editing her father's autobiographical narrative, A Doctor Among the Santals, the autobiography of Dr. Stephen V. Hansdag. She has also published several research papers in edited volumes and scholarly journals. She is an upcoming translator of Santali fiction into English. Since 2020, she has been editing an online journal titled the Johar Journal, of which two issues have been released. We are delighted to have you on the panel, Dr. Hansdag. Thank you for joining us this evening. Uh, our second speaker for the session is Dr. Onnoy Mukhopadhyay. Dr. Onnoy Mukhopadhyay is an assistant professor in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, Indian Institute of Technology, Kharagpur, West Bengal, India. Previously, he was an associate professor at Banaras Hindu University and the University of Burdwan. He was educated at Jadavpur University, Kolkata and BHU, wherefrom he obtained his PhD and successfully completed the course on Hinduism, Ritual, Caste and Gender offered by Oxford Centre for Hindu Studies, a recognized independent centre of the University of Oxford in August 2016, and was placed in the first class securing 84% marks. Dr. Mukhopadhyay's recent publications include, among others, Atheism and the Goddess, Thematizations of the Goddess in South Asian Cinema, Living Without God, a multicultural spectrum of atheism, the authority of female speech in Indian goddess traditions, Devi and womansplaining, the goddess in Hindu tantric traditions, Devi as corpse, literary and cultural readings of goddess spirituality, the red shadow of the mother, and why fiction matters. He has published two books of creative writing as well as fiction and poetry. His critical and creative writings have been published in noted journals in India, Australia, and USA. His works have been cited and discussed by reputed scholars in celebrated international journals, published by Sage, Taylor and Francis, Springer, and Cambridge University Press. He has presented papers and chaired academic sessions in national and international conferences in and outside India, and has contributed chapters to several edited volumes. His documentary film Saraswati, The Daughters of Saraswati, on women's Sanskritic education in an ashram in Varanasi, made with the startup grant awarded by BHU, was screened at the Center for Women's Studies BHU and is available on YouTube. He is an associate faculty at the Center for Advanced Studies in South Asia, Lalitpur, Nepal. On January 25, 2020, he was honored with the Yuva Ratan Award by the NRI Welfare Society of India, Delhi, at Pravasi Bharatiya Kendra, Ministry of External Affairs, New Delhi. Besides, he has received the Bharat Vikas Award conferred by ISR in addition to several awards for academic and co-curricular performance, including university medals for topping the merit lists in BA and MA examinations. His project title, Archiving the Heritage of Hindu Spiritual Congregations in Varanasi, along both synchronic and diachronic axis, is running at IIT Kharagpur. We are delighted to have you on the panel, Dr. Mukhopadhyay. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you,
Uh,
Shravan.
so, uh, so, uh, so we will now open the forum for discussion. I would request Dr. Hansda, ma'am, please share your insights with us today. The floor is open to you now, ma'am. Ma'am, you are on mute, ma'am. Ma'am, you're still on mute. Yes, ma'am, you're on. Yes, ma'am, you're.
Mute
Yes,
करना है.
yes, ma'am,
Am I
you're.
okay now? Oh, okay.
Yes,
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 yes.
yes, ma'am, you're audible.
Yes, yes. Okay. So I thought there was another speaker before us. There was another person from Europe. He's not come. So there are only two
Yes, ma'am,
speakers.
actually, yes, ma'am, he hasn't joined us as of now, but
Oh,
let's hope that he will join us.
okay. Okay. Yes, yes, yes. Okay, fine. So therefore, I'll be the first one to speak. Yes. I would like to begin by thanking the organizers for inviting me to this wonderful gathering of this wonderful talk, and I hope that what I say will be useful, valuable for the discussion. Uh, okay, so I'm going to speak. I'm supposed to speak on tribal representation in theology and myth, characters in religious and quasi-religious texts. Now, here I would like to bring together some work that I've already done. So, I would first like to talk about the Santhal creation myth. And then I would like to make some comparisons between the different versions that exist. And then I will focus on some important characters who are found in it. And then I have also found three female characters, archetypes, in these creation myths. So I will end by focusing about on these three archetypes. Okay, so the creation myth, the Santhal creation myth. Now, the Santhal creation myth was documented very early, at the end of the 19th century, and we have the first translation, the first documentation coming out in Santhali itself, and this was done by a Norwegian missionary, and his name was Lars Elo Skrefsrud. So this is called the Skrefsrud version, and then soon, and he belonged to the Scandinavian Lutheran Church, and this came out in the year 1887, and uh, it is said, it has been said that the Skrefsrud, he became a disciple of a Santhal guru named Kolyan Haram. He became the disciple of a Santhal guru, and you know, used to learn Santhali, and then he used to listen to his narratives and write it down. So the narrative was in verbatim, and then after that, it was not published for many years. For about 15 or 16 years, it was not published. And then much later, it was published in the year 1887. So the documentation was completed around 1872, but it was finally published in the year 1887. And this was done in Santhali, in the original Santhali. And this book was the Santhali book was called Hor Kuren Mari Hapram Kuriya Katha. Hor Kuren Mari Hapram Kuriya Katha. I know that this is a little difficult for you to understand, but basically, the literal meaning is that the the story told by the old guru of the Santals, the old guru of the Santals. Yes. And then, many years later, about 50 years later, it was translated into English by another missionary called P.O. Bodin. And this was published in English as The Traditions and Institutions of the Santals. And this was done in the year 1942. 1942. So we have the English version here and also the Santali version. Both of them are there. And a few years after the Santhali version was published, a few years later, the another version came out. And this was by Campbell, and Campbell was a missionary who was also working among the Santhals, but in a different area, and he belonged to the Scottish Free Church, and he brought out his version in the year 1892, and this came out in English in the I think the Evangelical Review, the Indian some Evangelical Review. So this came out in English. It did not seem to have had a Santhali version. At least I have not come across the Santhali version. So these were the first two versions that came into existence, and then you have other versions that were published much later. I think it was in the post-independence period when some other versions came out. I think in the 70s, 80s, 90s they came out, but then these are not translated into English. So therefore, I'll be looking at the two versions which are available to me, and they are both in English: the Campbell version and the Scripture version. And another one which is being done now, which is recently, some years ago, about 10 years ago, this project of documenting the creation myths of the tribal people of India, it was undertaken by the Sahitya Academy. But then the Sahitya Academy has not published this. It has not published this its study. So therefore, this is something which we don't have much knowledge about. But luckily, I was able to get a short paper from Professor Anvita Abi. Professor Anvita Abi used to teach in JNU, so I'm on good terms with her, and therefore she was at the time the honorary director of this Center for Tribal and Oral Languages in Sahitya Academy, and she was in charge of this project. And she gave me a short paper for my Johar journal. So from that, I have a very short version of the work that was being done, and therefore I can make a little bit of reference. But this is something for which I need more details, because a lengthy comparison cannot be made here. So I will just look at the Stepford and the Campbell version. Now, the important characters. Now, in this story, as we all know, the creation story talks about the Genesis. It's like the biblical Genesis. It talks about the beginning of the world and the beginning of humanity, and it also tries to explain why certain things happen in a certain way. So therefore, this is a kind of a very sacred ritual. It's a part of the sacred rituals of many tribal communities, because this is narrated in a very uh, ritualistic manner during certain festivals, and there is also a particular time, a particular setting for this, and it is not open for everyone. This is something which is only allowed to the people of the community, and it is only the person who is the guru, or the priest who is in charge of this. No, everyone cannot narrate this. So this is supposed to be very sacred knowledge, and it is not open for everyone. It's like a very limited audience, done before a very limited audience. So therefore, you have these stories. Yes. So the story about the creation of the world. Now, in these two versions, we find in both of them you have the supreme being, and the supreme being is Thakurjiu. Okay, so he's the supreme being, and he is generally seen as a male figure, a male figure. Okay, and he's also an authority figure. He is a person who has he's got a lot of people working under him, but he's the authority figure. So Thakurji is, he lives at a distance, and he does not communicate with humans much. Now, the creation of the world is supposed to have started when Thakurji um, first you have the beginning of the world, the creation of the world, and then you have the beginning of the creation of the aquatic animals. The fishes and the other aquatic animals were created first, and then after that you have the creation of humans. Okay, and then before the humans were created, yes, and you also have mention of some female deities, some minor deities, subordinate deities. Now, this is found in the Campbell version. In the Scriptural version, you do not have any mention of the female deities. You only have mention of a subordinate male deity called Maranguru or Lito or Maranguru. But the female deity is present in the Campbell version, where she's called Malin Budi or Gosainira, Malin Budi or Gosainira, and she is in some ways a very interesting person because she is not really the kind of female deity that you find in Hinduism. In Hinduism, you have there's a lot of dignity attached to the female deity, but here you have a female deity who seems to be rather incompetent because she makes mistakes. Okay, and then besides the female deity, you also have Maranguru, who's a male deity, and he also obeys. Both of them obey the commands of Thakurji, and then finally you have the humans. The two humans, the first two humans are Pilchu Haram and Pilchu Budi. Now, uh, the story of creation goes like this. In the beginning, when Thakurji decided to make humans, the create the world, he could not. He there was no yes he had to take help from the aquatic animals. He created the aquatic animals, but then he also had to take help from them because he could not. There was only water everywhere, and there was no land. So therefore, he had to. He had to. Yes, he had to get the land from under the water. So therefore, he got help from the earthworm and the tortoise, the earthworm and the tortoise. So the earthworm brought the earth from under the water and put it on the back of the tortoise, and then the tortoise was tied up to the top of the water, and its back, the mud, the soil, the earth that was brought from under the water was put on its back, so that it hardened and finally it became earth. And yes, and another thing is that the when the earth, yes, even before that, I think the humans. Now, humans actually were uh, they did not begin, with humans. It began with birds. Actually, this is again an area where there's a slight difference between the Campbell and the Scriptural version. Now, in the Campbell version, you have the after the earth is being created, there's some foam, and from the foam they create two two figures, and then these are stamped and broken by the horse, and then after who's called Singh Sadom. And then, but in the other version, you have these figures being made from the foam that is on the top of the water, and then uh, Thakur Ji, the Supreme Being, tells Malin Budi to go and get the life of humans from the top of the door. So there's a place where there's a lower area and the higher area. So the top of this thing, the frame, the door frame, has got the life of the humans, but below that there's another place where the life of birds is kept. And Merlin Moody makes the mistake of bringing the wrong life. She brings the life of birds. She does not bring the life of humans, and therefore the first things that are created are the birds. And then after that, these birds turn out to be the geese, what are called the Hers birds, or the geese. And these geese finally lay eggs. So when the earth is created, there is a place for them, and then they lay eggs there. And after they lay eggs, when the eggs hatch, then the two humans are born. And when the two humans are born, then they want to bring them up in a good place, because there's no place. So finally, they are given a very an area which is suitable for the humans to live, and this is called Hihidi Pipri. So Hihidi Pipri is the place where they grow up. Okay, and so therefore this is how. And yes, and then when the two humans grow up, one is a man and the one is a woman. So they are called Pilchu Haram and Pilchu Budi or Ayu. Okay. So when they grow up, then they, in the beginning, they live like humans, but then one day they live like brothers and sisters. But then one day, Marang Guru, who's one of the subordinate male deities working under Pilchu, under Thakurji. He comes to them in the in the guise of a grandfather, benevolent old man called a grandfather. So he comes and then he tells them about, teaches them some skills. He teaches them about cultivation and also teaches them uh, brewing rice beer, liquor, and then he after they have the rice beer, they finally, they go into a very amorous mood, and then they sleep with each other. And this is when they finally realize that they are not just like brothers and sisters; they also are, wife and husband. And then they are very ashamed of what they've done. But then when Marang Guru comes the next day and he sees that they are very ashamed and they are hiding, then he smiles and he says, no, it doesn't matter. So therefore, this is a beginning of humans and how they procreate. And then they have 14 children, 7 boys and 7 girls. And then after that, these 7 boys and 7 girls intermarry. And then they have the first 7 septs or the surnames are created. So these are the surnames that are created. My surname, Aini Hasda, is Hasda. That is supposed to be the name of the elder brother. And then you have Murmu, uh, Hemrom, Tudu, uh, many others. Okay, Soren. Okay, so there are the 7, and then 5 more are added later on. So there are altogether 12 surnames, but 5, the 7 surnames seen in the creation story that is written by Scripture. Yes. Now, when we compare these two versions, yes. Oh, yes. Yes. When we compare these two versions, we find that there are certain uh, differences, but then there are also many similarities. For example, as I said earlier, that Malin Puri does not appear in the scriptural version. She comes only in the Campbell version, and also you yes. So there are certain yes. Okay. Yes. So, okay, now I'll go on to the next point. Now, going through the different characters, I thought I would focus on 3 important female archetypes that I found. I call them archetypes, or I can call them, these characters who are quite well known. They become so. One is the Merlin Budi. I found this female deity extremely interesting, and she is supposed to be a person who obeys the male supreme god, Thakur. But she can be seen more as a bumbling kind of a female secretary. She is not very clever. She seems to make mistakes, so she brings the wrong life to the to the supreme being. And then you have another very interesting archetype. This is the first woman, that is Pilchu Budi or Pilchu Ayu, and she's like Eve. Okay, so she's like Eve, and she's the good mother and the good wife. Okay, and then you have the third one, and this comes out much later. You don't have it in the creation story. This is found in the other narratives that you find among the Santals, and this is the Dern or the witch, or in Hindi you call them the Dian, her the Dian. Now, the Dian plays a very important role also in the Santhal narratives, and she is an embodiment of evil, of pure evil, because she destroys everything that is around her, and sometimes she even, eats her own family members. So therefore, she does this for no reason at all. So therefore, this kind of, evil, that kind of evil that is found in the Dern, this is something that is really frightful, and this is something which uh, you know, creates a lot of fear among the Santhal people, because very often they believe that when anything bad happens to in their society, or there's an epidemic, or someone is dying, or someone is ill. They think that this is the work of a Dian, of a witch, a Dern. Okay, so these are the three very interesting archetypes I found. Okay, now I would like to focus on the Dian. Now, in the story that is recorded by Skeppster, and it is also translated by Boarding, we find that the there's the chapter 10 in this book, Traditions and Institutions of Santals. You go to chapter 10, and in that you have the story of the Dian, of the witch. And according to the story that you have, it is said that the 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 the, the Dern, um, uh, the this whole this secret knowledge of being a witch was taught to them by mistake by Maranguru. So the story goes that the men and the women, they were having men were having a lot of problem with their wives, because the wives were always scolding them, not listening to them. So finally, what they did was they tried to get help from Maranguru, and they told him that please teach us something, some skill, so that we can control our wives. And Maranguru in the beginning said, yes, I will help you, but you have to bring. He took out some leaves, sal leaves, and he said, you have to put your mark in blood on it. And this frightened the men, and they said, we'll come later on. And then the women heard about it. They heard about it because they were hiding somewhere. And then what they did was they decided to uh, get the knowledge that was supposed to be given to the men by deception. So what they did was they behaved very nicely with the men, and they made a lot of rice beer for them. And when the men were asleep, because they were not very alert, they went off to sleep that night. The women dressed up like men, and then they went to the forest, and they met Maranguru. And Maranguru gave them that knowledge. Also asked them to put their blood on the sign with in blood on the sal leaves, and then he taught them the knowledge. So the women went back with the knowledge, and when the men woke up, they realized that the knowledge had been given to the women. And then finally, the men also went to Maranguru, and he said that, well, I can't do anything about that, but I can help you to become teach you the skill of being the witch finder. So therefore, witch finder or witch doctor, or also called the Oja Janguru. So Oja Janguru and the Dun, these are supposed to be always in opposition to each other, and the Oja is always tries to struggle and control the woman, but the woman, the Dern is supposed to be very powerful, and sometimes she also manages to deceive the Janguru. So therefore, uh, the power of the woman is supposed to be something that is very difficult to control. So this is something which is found in the stories that are told by the by Kolian Haram, the old man, the man with whom Scripture spoke. And he also connects it to what was happening at the time, because this was during the colonial period. This was late 19th century, and he was talking about. If you read the whole narrative, he will talk about how Kolian Haram says that we are having a lot of problem because the English magistrates do not understand us. They do not understand the problem that we are facing. And when we tell them that we have to control the women and that they are eating us, then the English magistrates do not listen to us. They don't believe us, and they say that and then they explain that they don't eat in the normal way. They do it in a different way. So therefore, there's a lot of explanation that goes into it, trying to make Scripture understand that these witches actually exist. And so finally, this this what comes out of this whole story is that narrative is that the witches exist, and that they are always a war going on between the witches and the witch finders, and they basically, the witches are always the women, and the witch finders are the men. Okay. So this is something which is very interesting about the narratives that you find in among the Santals. And of course there are many other things too. Yes. So yes. Okay. Am I taking too much time? Am I okay? Yes. Okay. Now,
No,
in the
ma'am. You can
yes, yes,
continue.
yes. Okay. Now, uh, I would like to, yes, also make a reference to what some social activists have been saying. There are some social activists who have been, because witch hunting or the killing of witches is something which has been quite common for some time. So there are some writers like Gladson Dundung and also Ram Dayal Munda. They have been talking about this. So they have talked about it. They've talked about the attacks on witches, witchcraft, witch hunting as a brutal form of violence against women who are usually widows or who fight against the patriarchal system within their society. And they also say that this is also because of the erosion of traditional land rights of the tribal people. So basically, this is a phenomenon which is very widespread or found all over uh, Jharkhand, and but it is something which has reduced to some extent. So it is not the same as before. And among the Santals, I think it is not that much. Okay, so therefore, yes, so therefore, this is one of the clear remnants of the traditional beliefs that we still have. Many of the traditional beliefs are not there because changes have been happening in the past in these few years. So I won't say that these are still the same. Many changes have happened among the Santals, and also the influence of missionaries have also happened. For example, I am myself a Christian. I'm a Santal Christian, and my great grandmother was actually accused of being a witch. This is something which as I told you, I think this book was mentioned, A Doctor Among the Santals. Now, in this Doctor Among the Santals, this book has got the narrative of my father, and my father was a medical doctor, and he had gone to CMC Vellore, studied in CMC Vellore, and he had made these speeches when he had gone to the US to attend this CMC Vellore Alumni Association meet in Philadelphia, and there were two speeches he had made, and this he had started by how they had converted, how the conversion took place, and in that he's written very clearly that the conversion happened after his great grandfather Palu Hasda. His first wife, he had married several times. So his first wife was accused of witchcraft, and then they had to flee the village, and then they went to a Norwegian mission. And after they went there, they after some time they converted, and then he also himself became a pastor. Okay. So this story of how they converted, this is found in his autobiography, and then how his father and then he himself, they both worked. His father worked in a small school, and then afterwards my father turned out to be a very good student, but then he did not have the money. He didn't also have that many ambitions. He was only happy to be a school teacher, but then because he was very intelligent, he was told that you could become a doctor, medical doctor. So he was sent to CMC Vellore, and the missionaries helped him. So therefore, he ended up by becoming a medical doctor, and he worked in a tribal area. He worked in Dumka in this mission hospital called Mulpari Christian Hospital. So he worked there, and then of course we went to boarding schools, and we learned English. I mean, we were studying in a very different environment. So therefore, in that way, changes have happened. But then there's still many things that are still the same in some ways, but and I yes, and I when I was looking at when I was doing my PhD thesis, PhD dissertation, sorry, not PhD, MPhil dissertation. So when I was working on my MPhil dissertation, so in the first chapter, I had looked at anthropology and literature. So there I had I was working under Professor Minakshi Mukherjee, who was in English, English studies. But then I also had another supervisor, co-supervisor, Professor Tiplet Nomri, who was from sociology. And I tried to connect literature and anthropology. So therefore, I had looked at the colonial period and how the concept of tribe emerged, and how this was reproduced in literature, and how there was these different streams within it. So you of course had the glorification of the tribes, and then you had the romanticization also. So you had these different streams, and of course you had the primitive versus the civilized, the binary between the primitive and the civilized. Okay, so all these things I looked at, and then I had looked at Verrier Elvin with great detail. I found him very interesting. So Verrier Elvin was a person who was had tried to save the tribal's way of life, and he always argued against the influence of the mainstream. And so therefore he was a person who tried to, he became a center of a lot of controversy because he spoke about national parks, and then it was almost thought that he was trying to isolate them, he was trying to keep them separate away from others. But there was another group of anthropologists who opposed him, who said that they were not, the tribals were not, they were just backward Hindus. So therefore there was this dispute that went came started between the two of them, between G.S. Gurye, who belonged to the nationalist camp, and Verrier Elvin, who was the, he was the isolationist. So there was this assimilationist and isolationist trends that you find in the debate at the time, and this was during the 1930s and 40s. Okay, yes, and then also you have also the writings of a very well-known historian. His a historian, at least he was published in the historical review, Indian historical review. He was also published in Man in India. So he was a person who traced the ancestors of the present day tribes to the uh, to the to the Ramayana. He used the Ramayans, the Hindu epics. So he tried to trace them among these the forest dwelling tribes that were supporting Ravan. So the Ravan and his tribes. So he tried to trace the forefathers, the ancestors of the modern tribes among these the followers of Ravan. And he used the epic texts. So all these things I looked at. So it was during this time of great floods, time of great floods, and this some of this is still remained. This
Ma'am,
is whole idea of who the
uh,
tribes are. Yes,
uh, ma'am, ma'am, if I may please ask for
can
your
I wind
permission. Like, yes, yes, ma'am.
Can I wind
Actually,
up?
we have to
Okay,
keep an eye
no
on the
problem.
time.
Yes, yes, it's no problem. Okay, so basically that is all, and finally, I think maybe we will have the discussion afterwards. Yes. So basically, the two positions, assimilationist and or isolationist. A third position emerged, which was called integrationist position, and this was the position that was taken on later on by Verrier Elvin, because later on when he had a lot of criticism, like Thakkar had, I think Thakkar Bappa, I think he's called. He was one of the persons who had been a little critical of him, and he said that no, I actually this position that he had, he said it was with integration. So therefore, these three positions are still there. Okay. So with this, I'd like to conclude. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for this very expansive and this very interesting uh, talk on the Santhal creation myth. Thank you so much, ma'am. I would like to invite our next speaker, Dr. Onoy Mukhopadhyay. Sir, the floor is yours. Please share your insightful observation with us.
Okay, thank you, Shravana. It was very interesting to listen to Professor Ivy's talk because she was actually raising a lot of important issues. For instance, whenever we talk about the indigenous cultures in India, we often tend to either fall into the trap of this binaristic approach to civilization versus primitivism, or we try to romanticize the indigenous ways of life without looking at the complexities involved in the indigenous ways of life, especially the internal differences, diversities. For instance, if you think about the issue of gender, then of course it becomes quite complex, all the more complex, because the issue of witchcraft is something which has been associated by certain scholars with the religious systems in certain indigenous communities as well. So that's really a very complex and fraught issue, and it was really enlightening to listen to Dr. Ivy's talk. Now, as far as my approach to the indigenous theology or myth is concerned, I would like to focus on a few issues, including mostly methodological issues. That what are we going to do? What can we do to document and preserve the indigenous theologies or mythologies, and how can we look at the space of the sacred within the indigenous cultural space and the indigenous psychological space as well. Now, the first thing is that it's seldom that we look at the indigenous theologies or mythologies from the perspective of religious studies. In fact, if you look at the frameworks of religious studies, you'll find that it's still, obsessed with the idea of world religions. For instance, Hinduism, Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, etc. And when we talk at all about indigenous religions within the frameworks of religious studies as a discipline, we tend to either homogenize them by saying that most of the indigenous religions have certain things in common, and so we can identify certain central features of indigenous religions, or we try to look at them in a non-systematic way. That okay, so there is this myth, there is this theology, etc., etc., but we are not going to collate them in a systematic way. Now, this is quite problematic because if we really want to look into the religious lives of the indigenous communities in India, we need to apply certain methodologies of religious studies, but we also need to expand the contours of those methodologies. For instance, what the way we approach the other religions might not always be applicable to an indigenous religious system. And secondly, when we look at the faith systems in the indigenous communities, we need to look at the plurality. We need to acknowledge the plurality. For instance, if you think about the indigenous religions in India, there are so many. The sheer plurality of the indigenous religions needs to be underlined. Now, Dr. Ivy was referring to Professor Ramdayal Munda, and I would also refer to him because he wrote some extremely important works on indigenous forms of religiosity, and he was a person of an exceptional career because he was rooted in his own culture, in his own indigenous culture, but at the same time he was in a way a global intellectual. He started at Chicago. He taught in different universities. He was aware of the frameworks of religious studies. In fact, his own research work was on religiosity, the Vaishnavism in Panch Parganas, etc. And he pointed out one thing, that is, when we talk about the indigenous religions in India, the problem is that the census report presents those indigenous communities which are not Muslims, Buddhists, or Christians as either Hindus or as others. So there is one column, quote unquote, other. Now, this is quite problematic because in most of these cases, the communities which are thus being designated as Hindus are not Hindus. They would probably not see themselves as Hindus. So what is happening here is that in terms of documentation, there is a lacuna and there is a methodological lapse. So what do you need here? You need to point out one thing, that is, when we are talking about the indigenous religions, we need to look at the sheer diversity of these faith systems. So you need to expand your methodological horizon. So it's not just the case that, apart from the quote-unquote major religions or world religions, you have indigenous religions or other religions. It's not like that. You have to talk about each of these religions in a proper and systematic way. Having said that, I would also like to talk about the other project that Dr. Munda had. He, especially in his work on Adi Dharam, he said that certain, central features of indigenous faith systems could be pointed out, and he in fact presented a list as well. But the problem is that even though you can find certain common features in all these different religious systems, it's not the case that all of them are the same. So there are differences as well as commonalities. Now, if we focus only on the points of commonality, then it would become reductionist. And if we become, obsessed with the differences between different, Adivasi faith systems, then that would also be reductionist and even politically problematic. So what needs to be done is that one needs a systematic and here I'm talking about the kind of methodological systematicity that is followed in the discipline of religious studies. So from that perspective, you need a systematic documentation of all these different religious systems, faith systems. Now, the reason why I'm talking about the discipline of religious studies here is that if we don't look at these faith systems from the perspective of religious studies, then we will miss a lot of things. For instance, it might happen that when we are talking about, say, certain myths and legends, we will miss the religious significance or the sacred significance. But the problem is that when we work with the indigenous communities, most often you find that there are certain things which are secret and sacred. So secrecy and sacrality would go together. So for instance, if there is one particular sacred myth that is performed by the shamans, for instance, then it will not be disclosed, as Dr. Ivy was also pointing out. It won't be disclosed to a person who is from outside the community. And secondly, it might happen, and this is in fact something which is happening nowadays. But as far as the younger generation is concerned, it's found that sometimes they are probably not aware of these myths within an indigenous community. So there is some kind of gap in the channel of intergenerational communication of such sacred myths. Now, and yes, there is another problem, that is sometimes the shaman might not want that sacred myth to be documented, to be shared with the others in public. Now, in that case, what do you do as a researcher? Of course, you are not supposed to, you have to maintain research ethics as well. So you can't really go there and try to find out something which is not meant for you. But in that case, what happens is that probably the religious framework of that community or the faith system of that community won't be properly documented by the researcher, by the ethnographer. So there are these problems, but still we have to try to systematically document all these different faith systems. For instance, the faith system of the Mundas, the faith system of the host, the faith system of the gods, and so on and so forth. So you need a larger archive. That is very important. Without that larger archive, our understanding of indigenous religiosity would be reductionist. And that's why, most often we have either a romanticizing view or a kind of, neocolonialist view. We seldom have a balanced approach to indigenous forms of religiosity and the problems associated therewith, right? For instance, if we talk about the preservation of the indigenous faith systems, then we also need to think about both the positive and negative aspects of those faith systems. So what would you like to preserve and what would you like to change or transform? So that is another issue. For this, I think the best method could be the participation of the community members themselves It's not the case that all the community members would have access to these stories. That doesn't happen actually. This is what I've seen from my own experience. But still, the only way to address this issue is to involve the community members from all these indigenous communities in the formation of the archive of all these different faith systems. And you also need to identify all these different faith systems as unique faith systems rather than clubbing them together as indigenous religions or calling them Hindus or other Hindus or something like that. So that kind of confusion needs to be corrected. And I think this is a very significant issue which was raised by Ramdal Munda, which is still quite relevant. Thankfully, nowadays there is, an attempt at archiving different indigenous worldviews, different indigenous, ideas of spirituality, and so you will find a lot of material even on the internet. Dr. Ivy herself is, working on that. But still, there is a lacuna, and I think there is a lacuna in terms of archiving, these different faith systems. And for that, you do need the methodology of religious studies. Without that, the faith, the faith system won't be properly preserved. This is one thing. Secondly, when we talk about tribal theology, we need to understand that the ideological, ethical, spiritual principles which shape such theologies are quite unique and different. For instance, if you approach this world with a kind of binaristic view that you're good and evil, black and white, then it will not work, because you would often find divine figures that are also trickster figures. So a divine figure is not necessarily someone who is complete, who is goodness personified. It's more complex. So the ethical texture of such cosmogonies, such indigenous cosmogonies, is often quite complex, and that is what needs to be taken into account. Secondly, when we talk about the indigenous faith systems in India, the Adivasi faith systems, we also need to look at the different points of hyphenation, collision, or even collaboration between different indigenous cosmogonies, and the different indigenous cosmogonies on the one hand and the Hindu cosmogonies on the other. For instance, it has been observed that many of the mythologies in Hinduism, many of the cultural and religious practices in Hinduism have actually come from the Adivasi cultures, from the Adivasi worldviews. Especially if you think about the Tantras, a lot of things are there which have actually come from the Adivasi worldviews. Not in a non-transformed way. Probably there is a lot of modification, there is a lot of change, but you can actually trace the Adivasi roots of such religious ideas, such religious texts. So, for instance, in Sanskrit texts, you have references to the Vanavasis. So, in the Ramayana, for instance, you have a very complex representation of the interactions between the people from the city, the urban space, with the people in the forest. And when we talk about the forest in the Ramayana, it's a huge expanse, both geographically and culturally. For instance, if you think about Chitrakoot, and if you think about the Dandakaranya, you will find that they are not they are not forests, so which can be clubbed together simply as the forest with capital F. That's not the case. So there are internal differences between the forest spaces as well. And what is interesting here is that if you look at the Indic civilization, you'll find that throughout millennia, here we had not just the urban and the rural, but also the forest as the third sort of spatial trope. And during the colonial times, a lot of scholars, ideologues, intellectuals, Rabindranath Tagore, for instance, underlined the value of the forest in the cultural life of India. But unfortunately, even in the case of Tagore, you don't have a proper and wide sort of exploration of the forest dwellers. So what was the contribution of the forest dwellers to the Indic civilization? And that's in fact the question that has been raised by Ramdal Munda as well. That you need to talk about the contribution of the Adivasi worldviews to what we now see as the Indic civilization. So it's not the case that they are just the the marginal sort of communities on the fringes of this great civilization. Rather, they have contributed greatly to this civilization, but unfortunately, that contribution has not been properly documented or acknowledged, and it's very difficult to sort of excavate the exact forms of contribution made by the Adivasi communities to the Indic civilization as a whole. But if you look at the paintings, the graphic aspects of various cultural formations in India, if you look at the texts, Sanskrit texts, vernacular texts, scriptures, you will always find that there is a conspicuous influence of Adivasi culture. It's very clear. And it's not just the case with the Ramayana. Even in the case of the Mahabharata, you have that. In the Harivansha, you have that kind of, conspicuous influence of Adivasi cultures. And in fact, in all these cases, you have a confrontation as well as collaboration. So both tales of confrontation and tales of collaboration between the Adivasis and non-Adivasis would be found there, and ignoring either of them would be reductionist. As a political, ideological, or even an intellectual approach. Secondly, what is interesting for me is that even though it's not the case that in all the Adivasi religions you have a centrality of the goddess or the feminine divine, we always have this kind of figure of the feminine divine positioned at the point of the hyphenation between folk Hinduism and Adivasi religiosity. Now there are certain ethnographic explorations which I have made, so if I have time I will talk about that in brief. But even before that, it would be pertinent here to mention that the goddess of Central India, the goddess in Central India, has been referred to in the Harivansha and in the Mahabharata, and it's very clear that this goddess is worshipped by the Adivasis. The Sanskrit texts refer to the goddess as being worshipped by the Adivasis. And later on, with the rise of Tantra, you have a very peculiar kind of hybridization of the Sanskrit kind of textual format, the Sanskritic scriptural structure that, a Tantra has a certain structure. It has a specific way of, argumentational progression. So that is there, the Sanskritic frame is there, but most often, especially in the case of certain late medieval tantric texts, you find that the content is coming evidently from Adivasi worldviews. But the problem is that in this way, what happens is that you often don't get the exact Adivasi worldview. It becomes mediated through certain Hindu tropes. So that also becomes a problem. Now, when we come to the present time, we find that exploring Adivasi religions in terms of cultural studies is something which is happening. So it's a good sign that the documentation is now there. Earlier, there was a lack of documentation, or most of the documentation was being done by the colonial sort of officers or by people who probably didn't have full access to the worldviews of these communities. But nowadays, a lot of community members are themselves, documenting their myths, their theologies. But again, here the problem is that I am actually trying to argue for a very complex and self-reflexive position of the researcher, the religious studies researcher. How am I supposed to approach the worldview of such a community if I am a religious studies scholar? What should I do? Should I apply all the existing parameters of religious studies as a discipline, or should I modify them? Now, my point is that we have to modify them. For instance, if you talk about theology, that's fine because gods are there, right? So theos is there. So the theological content is there, and it's important to acknowledge the theology of an indigenous community, because most often you will find that an indigenous community is one which has an extremely sophisticated theology. So it's not the case that it's a primitive worldview or something like that. In fact, it's a wrong idea that most of these communities are just, polytheistic or sort of idol worshippers. In fact, in many cases, we'll find that they don't worship idols; they worship aniconic images, right? So, and then there is also this issue of eco-spirituality, which is again, the area that I often explore in my own work. Now, if you look at the focus on eco-spirituality in any indigenous religious worldview, you will find that there is a focus on sacred sites, sacred places within the land that they inhabit. Now, this is quite interesting, and this is quite interesting for me because when I look at the focus on the Hindu sacred sites, I often consider these Hindu sacred sites to be the outcome of the integration of two worldviews. One is the abstract universalist worldview that comes from the Vedic culture, where you worship the more abstract aspects of nature. For instance, you worship the air, you worship light, and so on and so forth. And on the other hand, you have this Adivasi tradition of worshipping some natural entity that is more concrete and more evidently material in nature as well. And in my own work, I have called it a kind of spiritual materialism, because here the spiritual and the material are integrated, they are closely intertwined. So, for instance, when you have this idea of a sacred mountain, when you have the idea of a site around a tree, a certain plot of land around a tree, which is sacred, which is held to be sacred by an indigenous community, you find that here the approach to nature is different. Of course, there is a respectful attitude towards nature, but here nature is not seen as abstract. Nature is not an abstraction, but it is seen as concrete and concretely material. So this focus on concrete materiality is something which is quite evident in indigenous forms of eco-spirituality. And this is something which is quite evident in one Urao myth. I have written on this as well. So the myth is something like this. A sparrow flew away and an archer shot at it. And the drops of blood fell on the land, and the places where the drops of the blood of the sparrow fell, those places became sacred sites. So there is the idea that there were Mahadaniya villages, so these villages became sacred, sanctified by the blood of the sparrow. And in fact, interestingly, as far as the myth of the Sati-Pithas is concerned in Hinduism, you can actually draw parallels, and I have also drawn parallels between them. In fact, the scholars who worked previously on the Hindu Sati Pithas also focused on this, that Sati's body getting dismembered and the body parts of Sati falling down on earth, sanctifying certain places, which become the Pithas, the sacred sites of the goddess. So what is interesting here is that there is a focus on the bodily aspect of existence, the material aspect of existence, and this materiality is seen as sacred. So, while on the one hand, in Hinduism, you have this this negative attitude to the body, to materiality. On the other hand, especially in Tantric Hinduism, you have a celebration of the bodily and material aspects of existence, and that is exactly what you find in the Adivasi traditions. So you can understand that it has come from the Adivasi traditions. And in the case of Adivasi theologies or even theologies where there are goddesses, what you need to note is that, number one, you need to identify the pantheon. It's a very difficult job because, in fact, one of my scholars is working with a community in Kerala, and it's in fact a quite difficult job because number one, as I said, you are not supposed to have access to all the material which is held to be sacred and secret by the community. Secondly, it's also difficult to understand exactly which role is being played by a deity, because, as I said, the deities are polyvalent in indigenous traditions, and you might even find variations in terms of geographical locations. For instance, if the same community lives in two places, as it happens with many communities, many indigenous communities, you might find certain variations in terms of the narratives, in terms of the ideological and spiritual import of the narratives and all that. So there will be certain variations. And secondly, the problem is that the pantheon, as we understand it, for instance, the moment we talk about a polytheistic pantheon, we generally tend to work with certain templates that have come from Europe. For instance, the Greco-Roman pantheon and all that. But we need to understand that unlike the Greco-Roman pantheon, here we have living pantheons. So in order to understand these living pantheons, you need to look deeply into their functions, and it's not always like the Hindu pantheon. There might be parallels between the deities in Hinduism and the deities in one indigenous community, but that doesn't necessarily mean that with your knowledge of the Hindu pantheon you would be able to understand that pantheon. So you need to develop your skills, you need to engage more with the community members, and only then will you get to understand what is happening there. And in fact, I believe that it's only a collaborative kind of work which will be fruitful here, when a community member himself or herself is involved in this project of archiving the theology of that community. Now, finally, I would say that when we talk about the indigenous religions in India, we need to talk about the not just the history and the development of these communities, but also the present significance of their religious life. And so this is what I call a synchronicist kind of approach, where you talk about the present significance, today's significance as far as these religious systems are concerned. What can we learn from them? Are all the aspects of such forms of religiosity acceptable to all the members within those communities? As we understood from Dr. Ivy's talk, that doesn't always happen. For instance, if you have certain marginal communities or marginal groups or individuals within an indigenous community, then you also need to critically look at that religious system. So it's not just about romanticization or valorization, but at the same time, it shouldn't be denigration either. So and it's only when you approach all this different about the mythology of a living community, a living mythology, it is never devoid of a spiritual content, right? So, for instance, the Greco-Roman gods and goddesses are not being worshipped except by the neo-paganists, but these deities are worshipped by communities that live today. So, you need to have that idea in mind that we are dealing with living pantheons and not dead pantheons of gods and goddesses. The documentation, number one, the documentation is required. Number two, the documentation needs to be done sensitively, exhaustively, and with the help of the community members. Number three, the religious studies discipline, the discipline of religious studies can help us a lot in this project, but the recent ideas, methodologies, or guiding principles that we follow in the domain of religious studies also need to be modified. And when you undertake ethnographic work in the context of indigenous religious systems, your existing methodological paradigms keep changing, and you have to keep them flexible and open-ended so that you are not imposing the existing structures of religious studies on these faith systems, but rather you are engaged in a dialogic sort of interaction between the community that you are exploring and the existing methodology that you have with you. So that would be my take on preserving and critically looking at the theologies and mythologies of the indigenous communities in India. I guess this has great scope for research in future, and we need to enthuse more and more scholars to do this, but with the caveat that don't subsume the indigenous religious systems within the discipline of anthropology or neurology. Because what happens in that case is that sometimes we miss some of the nuances which come out when you approach them from the perspective of religious studies. Thank you, Shravan.
Thank you so much, sir, for this very detailed talk and for telling us the importance of archiving and also how forest and ecology in general has played a huge role in the narrativization of the tribal tradition. Thank you so much, sir. We will now move on to the question and answer session. My first question is to Dr. Ivy Hansda. Ma'am, how do tribal individuals who have converted to Christianity negotiate their dual identities as both tribal and Christian? How do they navigate the tensions and challenges between their indigenous cultural heritage and their new religious beliefs?
Huh. Yes, a very interesting question. Yes. Now, this is an issue that this question I had raised when I was working on my father's autobiography. I had written a very lengthy introduction, and then I had raised this question. And then I had also said, yes, I remember the words I used was that it is not, yes, and one of my, the person who wrote the forward also, Professor Anand Mahanand, and then another introducer, the Marin Karen from France. So we had discussed this, and I had discussed this at some length, and I had spoken about how the you cannot have an either or approach. You cannot have like either you are this or you are that. It can be both, either and or. I mean, it can be both. You can be both. Okay, and also because I think a Santhal identity, tribal identity, is something which is goes deeper. In fact, it goes deeper very often than the religious identity is something which I think uh, it is. Uh, I think the indigenous identity is, I think, much deeper. Even caste identity, that is much deeper. It goes much deeper. Yes, because recently there was this debate about the Muslim, uh, what are these lower caste Muslims, and there was this uh, uh, discussion that I was watching. I was watching it on YouTube, and there was this top story about a girl who had converted from Rajput into Muslim. Her family had converted, and then there was a Dalit Hindu who wanted to marry this girl, and he converted from his community to Islam, Muslim. And then the both he became a Muslim, but then the girl's family still would not accept him because they said you may have joined the religion, but you are still the same caste. So you are still the same caste. So I think this awareness of, even though entering another religious fold, becoming a, 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 a Christian, yet being within that in religion also, in among Christians also and among Muslims also, you do have that, that caste hierarchy is still there, that Manuwadi thought is still there. So therefore, one still remains a tribal Christian. I mean, uh, just because a person becomes a Christian doesn't mean that a person suddenly is accepted by everyone in that community. Even the Dalit Christians, like look at the writings of Bama. She's written. I think you must have heard of Bama Karuku. So there have been so many writers, and there are all these studies being done. Even the uh, Pasmina Muslims, I think. Recently, there was this the lower caste Muslims. There was this. The BJP said that it would focus on these Muslims, the poorest Muslims, the outcast Muslims, the Pasman. I forgot the name. Okay, so there are these three different hierarchies. Like they have three different, the three folds. So in them also, among them also, there are three. So the lowest one, which is the one that is always not accepted by the other two. So therefore, this is also found among the Christians who have converted. So Christians are still not completely accepted as among all the Christians, all the others. So therefore, I think that one does not completely leave behind one's identity. Just becoming a Christian doesn't, make you lose your identity. And also another thing is that we still do have many cultural practices. Like we do have dancing, we have singing, we speak the language, and in many ways we eat the same food. And yes, I mean, there might be some areas where we do accept Christian practices, Christian beliefs, but we also in some other ways we do still have the old practices. So I think this is more like a synchronization. A new community is formed. It's not completely Christian. It's not completely the traditional Santhal, but it's somewhere in between. So it's a beginning, a new community, emergence of a new community. Yes, and this is also something that happens among the Dalits also, among the Indian Christians also. I mean, I had worked in my PhD. I had worked on the conversion among three upper caste women and their writings. I had worked at Pandita Ramabai. I had worked on Lakshmi Bai Tilak, three women who had converted to Christianity. And then the way I had seen it was that the Indian Christians were still not seen as the same on par with the Western Christians. They were still seen as put in another bracket. And then also among the Indian Christians, also you had different groups. You had the Dalit Christians, you had the upper caste Christians also, and they had the Christian villages. So in the Christian villages, you had these lower castes who had en masse. They had converted en masse. They would live in these Christian villages many times, and then the upper caste Christians would have a better status, many more privileges, and they were the ones who later on went on to become the leading members of the Christian churches. So therefore, all these things have been found. There is always a hierarchy. There has always been a hierarchy. Okay. So therefore, one does not automatically enter a very elevated place just because one converts. The क्या कहते हैं उसको baggage is still there. Okay. Yes. So therefore, one does negotiate, and I think
Thank you so
that
much, ma'am.
I think I have managed to negotiate quite well, because I think my father had a very good education, and he sent us to some wonderful schools. So I grew up among many, in boarding schools, among the elite boarding schools, among Hindu girls, upper caste Hindu girls. So I don't think I had much problem, but I think people in my community who have converted, they go through some, I think they have other experiences, different experiences. But I think the Christians have overall, I think, contributed a lot to society, because they have, they are doing good jobs. They are also, contributing in many ways to society. They are in teaching jobs. Many of them are working as nurses. They are also in bank. They are working as bank officers among my friends circle, among my father's peer group. They are in good jobs. They are, contributing to society. So I think that, and of course, at the same time, they speak in Santhali at home, but they speak in Hindi when they're outside, when they are in, at their workplace, and the children are learning English too. So therefore, I think that uh, integration, जिसको कहते हैं ना, what we are talking about integration, that is happening. So we are trying to, balance our different identities. The Santhal identity is still going to be there. Yes, I can speak Santhali fluently, but yes, I must say that my nieces and nephews sometimes, they are not very good at learning Santhali. They are forgetting. So the younger generation, the next generation, I think, maybe I think they are going to, forget some of the cultural practices. It's possible. Yes. Okay.
Thank you so much, ma'am. My next question is to Dr. Mukhopadhyay. Sir, are there instances where Hinduization has led to the erasure or marginalization of indigenous tribal traditions? How can these communities navigate the tension between preserving their cultural heritage and adapting to new religious influences?
Okay, so thank you for the question, but I will have to be brief because actually I have co-edited a full book on atheism, theism, shifts between theism and atheism. So if I get into that, then it will become a prolonged discussion. But yes, to focus on the first part of your question, Hinduization. Now, as I have already pointed out, there are two things here. If you think about the long, very long, in fact, millennia old history of the cohabitation of the Adivasi communities and quote unquote Hindus, because this, I mean, if we talk about the history of the Hindus, then probably you will not find the term in all the phases of the history of Hinduism. But I put this term within quotes. So the Adivasis and the Hindus, they have been involved in a paradoxically, confrontational and collaborative cohabitation for millennia. There have been fights, there have been struggles, there have been bitter skirmishes, but there have been points of collaboration as well. Now, secondly, if you think about Hinduism from below, folk Hinduism and Adivasi religiosity. Now, there have been points of hybridization and hyphenation, which have emerged organically through this process of cohabitation. And as I said, in fact, I am not happy with this very idea of Hinduization of Adivasi communities, because if you take the term Hindu, this term is something which is incomplete without involving the Adivasi cultural ontology. Because, ontologically speaking, the term Hindu must involve the contribution. It must acknowledge the contribution of Adivasi cultures to what we understand to be Hinduism. If you talk about, Vedism or Vedic culture, that's a different issue. But the moment we talk about Hinduism, we are using a much more inclusive term. So we have to talk about Tantric Hinduism, we have to talk about folk Hinduism, we have to talk about those forms of Hinduism which have grown from below. From the marginalized sectors of the society. So it has always been there. And that's why I talked about Professor Ramdal Munda's work as well. And he says that it's a pity that till this day, we have not properly explored the contribution of the Adivasi traditions to the formation of Hinduism. If you talk about the history of Hinduism, that would always be incomplete without acknowledging the contribution of the Adivasi religious systems, cultural systems. My friend Jeffrey D. Long is working, he has worked on this, the interface between Adivasi cultures and Hinduism. In fact, there are a lot of books available where the Adivasi roots of certain Hindu practices have been traced. So the moment we talk about Hindu versus Adivasi, it becomes a problematic kind of statement, because Hinduism itself is indebted to Adivasi cultures. So it's not the case that it's something there which is free of the ontology of Adivasi culture, right? So when we talk about religious ontologies, in this context, it's very difficult to talk about any purist kind of, if someone believes in a purist kind of Hinduism, that's a different thing. But if you talk about the inclusive definition of Hinduism, then it's it can't be thought of without thinking about the Adivasi contribution to it. This is one. Secondly, when you think about Hinduization from below, so that is again just a kind of conversion. So then in certain respects, it's the same kind of thing as as Christianization or Islamization, any kind of conversion. But there are certain differences as well. For instance, as I said, as far as Hinduism is concerned, there are certain common belief systems, certain common ideas. For instance, if you think about this idea of the sacred space, so yes, to some extent there would be some kind of eraser. For instance, you might find that the Adivasi god is renamed as a Hindu god. That is a possibility. So you lose something, but at the same time you have something, because that sacred site is probably maintained. It's not discarded. Secondly, if you, and here I will talk about my own research, my own sort of engagement with such situations on the field. So what I have observed, I will talk about two instances. One is a temple here in Jhargram, where you have a deity who has been mistakenly referred to as the tribal Durga by the newspaper reportings, because it's actually an indigenous goddess who was revealed in some dream to an Adivasi woman. And interestingly, the priest is an Adivasi priest. The priest is not a Hindu priest, but it's frequented by Hindus from all strata of society, and that is very interesting, because when we talk about folk Hinduism, we often mistakenly assume that there is some kind of classical Hinduism out there which is different from folk Hinduism, and probably privileged Hindus have nothing to do with folk Hinduism, but that is actually not the case. In fact, this temple is visited by a lot of professors from IIT Kharagpur as well. So this is interesting. Then secondly, there is another instance that is from the village of Ramdal Munda himself. It's called the Diuri village in Jharkhand. And there is a temple of a Shalavuji Durga. So you have a 16-handed Durga temple. And interestingly, in that temple, you have Hindu priests, Brahmin priests, and you also have Adivasi priests. So there is this culture of sharing. So it's a common space that is shared by these two cultures. Now, it's very difficult to say what kind of term we should use for such a phenomenon. Would you say that it's a Hinduization of an originally Adivasi goddess? Now, to some extent, that is the case, because probably the site was an Adivasi site, but you don't have eraser really, right? So, and of course, the Adivasi priest would worship the deity in a different way from the way the Hindu priest would worship the deity. So it's not the case that there is a superimposition or an eraser or an exclusion. Rather, there is an inclusion. And it's interesting that even though Ramdal Munda was himself quite critical of, of forced not forced, of sort of a conversion of Adivasis to the Hindu fold, because he quite rightly pointed out that if you try to superimpose the caste structure of Hinduism on the Adivasis, then that is wrong, because the Adivasis don't belong to the caste structure of Hinduism. So he was critical of that. But interestingly, Ramdan Munda himself used to visit this temple, the temple of Shailabuji Durga that I'm talking about. And in fact, in his home, there was a shrine of the goddess. So when we look at such phenomena, we have to distinguish between Hinduism from below and Hinduism from above, something that happens organically through the millennia old practices of collaboration as well as confrontation between Hindu belief systems, Adivasi belief systems and practices. And on the other hand, as I said, something that is a matter of superimposition. And as far as the adaptation to new religious influences is concerned, I would see that, most often you will find that actually that's why I'm saying that a religious studies framework is required, because if you look deeply into these practices, you will find that there are other common factors. For instance, in many of these temples where the Adivasi goddess and the Hindu goddess become one, you will find the celebration of the goddess during autumn, so that would synchronize with Navratra. But it would be wrong to, and that general idea has been that it's a kind of superimposition of Navratra on the Adivasi goddess cultures, but actually it's not so. If you closely look at the eco-spiritual context of both Navratra and many other such festivals which happen in different parts of India in autumn, in the tropical autumn, you will find that the common thread is probably the seasonal cycle. It's not really based on a particular deity. So probably that is what connects these two things, right? So that's why I would say that in this context, we need a more nuanced approach, a more complex approach. And we need to distinguish between what is problematic and what is acceptable, because see, that in today's India, what is necessary is the acknowledgement of commonalities as well as differences. If you focus solely on differences, then that might result in violence, intercommunal hatred and so on and so forth. That is problematic because we have had the experience of the partition, right? So overemphasis on difference in this context is also problematic. We can't really afford to do that, unlike the Western postmodernists, because their history is different from ours. Thank you.
Thank you,
I
sir. Yes,
Okay,
ma'am.
okay,
Please continue. No, ma'am.
please continue. Finish your. I will. Actually, I saw Professor Macken, the one who's been late, who's late in joining, the third speaker. I think he sent a message. I saw it in the chat. In the chat, this window, the window chat. I saw his message, Professor Macken. I think. Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Sorry.
Ma'am,
Yeah.
his text is not visible to me. I mean, in the chat box, I cannot see his text.
Acha, acha. I
Okay,
saw it and then it just disappeared. It disappeared. It was there for some time and then it disappeared. Okay, okay, fine. Please continue.
Yes, I would just like to thank Dr. Mukhopadhyay for answering to the question. This brings us to the end of today's session. I thank all the panelists once again for sharing their invaluable perspectives on the topic. This is also to remind that we are calling for submissions on tribal literature and tribal representation in literature, the details of which can be viewed on www.tellmeyourstory.biz. We will come back to you soon with our next panel discussion on the topic. Till then, good night, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you.